And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA CIB, powering Africa's potential from ground to grid. Proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025. Good evening. Welcome to The Money Show. I'm Stephen Grootes. Plenty going on, and was very interested to read this afternoon that the International Trade Administration Commission is proposing a 15% import tax on the batteries that go into hybrid and electric cars. We'll talk to the Chief Commissioner there, Icasa, in just a moment. It's a kind of economic issue around a tariff that goes in many different directions, but just a reminder of kind of how important tariffs suddenly are, the conversations that we're having about them kind of all over the place. I've been thinking a little bit about black economic empowerment, and I was struck by something that Saki Matlozoma said last night, and we'll replay part of that conversation a little later in the show, but he basically made the point that in the 1990s, as we were coming out of apartheid, it was clear, and I'll sort of paraphrase his words, so I'm not speaking sort of for him, but he basically said that we knew it would be untenable to have a sort of politics dominated by people. I think the phrase he used was of a particular hue, and the economy dominated by people of a different hue, with lots of poor people in between. I thought that was an important point. One of the things that does frustrate me, and I know that the Solidarity Research Institute and the Free Market Foundation, they've put out a report today about broad-based black economic empowerment, and I think you already know that they'll oppose it. They say that it puts a sort of cost of 2 percentage points of GDP. I must say, while there are all sorts of conversations to have, and I'm very happy to have conversations around it, I don't believe that ending BEE would automatically make the economy grow. If it is a factor, I think it's a relatively small factor compared to everything else, by which I mean lack of electricity, lack of the rule of law, the violence in our society, councils, water, electricity, the whole bit. I think if we sort those things out first, they'll have a much bigger impact than removing BEE. Good to hear from you this evening on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. Voice notes tonight on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
All right, so the International Trade Administration Commission of South Africa proposing that batteries for electric and hybrid cars, sort of called new energy cars, should have a 15% tariff. The idea is that would incentivize car manufacturers to make their cars here, would get the whole battery industry going, etc. And ITEC suggests this would give cars made here a price advantage. Ayabonga Tkawe is the Chief Commissioner at ITEC. Chief Commissioner, good evening. What exactly are you proposing?
Good evening to you, Stephen, and good evening to your listeners as well. We are proposing here an amendment to the auto-industrial program that has a combination of cash incentives and tax offsets, and we administer a large part of the tax offset elements. And that program currently has a list of raw minerals and materials which, when sourced from SACU, would make the eligible firms beneficiaries of some benefit under the program, in relation to kind of duty offsets and in managing their customs liability account. So effectively what we're saying here is, with the advance in automotive propulsion technologies, from combustion engines towards hybrids and new energy vehicles, battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids and so on, that the scope of these materials that would go into these vehicles of different propulsion technologies needs to be widened. Because in a typical combustion engine vehicle, we would have had under our program steel, brass, platinum group metals, leather, and all manner of other materials that would be, when sourced from the customs union, make these firms liable for benefits for local content and that type of thing. And as we shift towards battery electric vehicles, as you would know, that many of those batteries are made from a combination of minerals and materials that are found in some relative abundance in the Southern African Customs Union and in the Southern African Development Community. And so this really is in keeping in toe step with some of those developments in propulsion technologies, and we are trying by this effort to really harmonize and align our auto-industrial package to move in concert with that.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the consequences of that would be that if you were bringing in an electric or hybrid car into South Africa, it would attract a higher tariff than it does now. Would that be correct? I know there's a tariff on them already.
Well, it would depend, though, Stephen. So if it's a completely built-up unit, definitely. I mean, even with combustion engine cars, you do pay a duty when you bring it in, fully built up. And the rationale for that is we have had, for the last 100 years in South Africa, a industry assembling vehicles. And so we would rather wish to incentivize people bringing in componentry in scattered, completely knocked down parts, and in assembling these, also using accompanying South African components, add value, raise investment, and more importantly, create jobs. So indeed, that is certainly still very much part of the logic. But the other thing we've put in the Gazette, which we issued on the 29th of May, Stephen, is we want to get a sense from interested parties about what we are considering, which is the possibility of increasing customs duties to electric vehicle batteries to the bound rate of the WTO concessions we signed on to at 15%. So that if you bring in the scattered components and you assemble those batteries, you have some effective protection when you compete with completely built-up batteries that would have been assembled or made elsewhere. That's really the rationale, yeah.
No, I mean, that all makes sense to me, but let me just put an example to you, because I mean, I'm no expert on all of this, but as I understand it, the car industry is changing rapidly, particularly in China, which has the greatest incentive right now to export cars to us, okay?
Yes.
But the cheapest electric car that is currently on sale in China, it's the BYD Seagull. It costs less than $8,000. That's less than 150,000 Rand. If you added a tariff of 15% to that, that's 22,500 Rand. So you would then be able to buy an electric car for, let's call it around 210,000 Rand, right?
Well, maybe add some excise duties and a few other maybe.
Sure.
Maybe, let's say 250,000, $250,000, yeah.
Okay. But you would be needing then our car industry to be able to make an electric car for less than that.
Well, not necessarily. I think the point that we're making, though, is that you would want, for whomever might signal the intent to invest in assembling these cars, to have some effective protection that would, one, raise the show floor cost of the imported one. And then, of course, there are many other things we would have to do. Certainly, this is not a blue pill here that we are proposing.
Sure.
There are many other things, Stephen, as you would know, that drive the cost of locally assembled vehicles. One of which, by the way, it happens to be many of the costs that domestic manufacturers face, some of which are set by the state. So if indeed you want to compete toe-to-toe with a car that is manufactured under considerable administered price support in a place like China, you have to consider to what degree you might want to calibrate the cost-price relationship for domestically assembled vehicles, which is also the issue that many of the auto assemblers here are facing.
Sure.
Many of them assemble premium vehicles, but also many of them are facing, to be honest, competition even in smaller vehicles from subsidized countries of origin, and are also faced with another challenge of imported second-hand cars, which are competing toe-to-toe at a much lower price point, arising from some of the policies of other parts of the world where these cars come from.
Okay, let me put another argument to you. It could be argued like this. Our government should try and do everything humanly possible to cut down our emissions. And to do that, we should encourage South Africans as quickly as we can to drive hybrids and electric cars. Yeah. And if the Chinese government wants to subsidize that, that's fine.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. Stephen. I think if you take that argument to its logical conclusion, then let us collapse the entire notion of a nation state and the sovereign domain of a policy. So it is this mix between kind of production platforms of a multinational scale and the national boundaries of territoriality and so on. So it's a difficult debate. But I think the point you're raising, though, is fundamental. That if we want, in line with our national determined contributions from an emissions perspective, to incentivize more and more South Africans to take up new energy vehicles, I think there is a combination of things we could do. We've seen Europe use consumer subsidies, and of course that has created an inlet for many lower or relatively lower priced Chinese cars. And that's why the EU at the moment is busy with a debate on trade remedies and price ceilings with the Chinese. They are having that discussion as the Eurozone. And similarly, in our case, we might not have the fiscal space to have consumer subsidies, but there are many other things we could use to subsidize or make relatively more attractive the acquisition of some of these new electric vehicles. Some of it, of course, is in the licensing. I mean, what would it look like, for instance, Stephen? Think with me here for a second. If you had your e-Natis licensing every year, say you pay 899 Rand for your car, and I assume it's a combustion engine car, and if you were to buy an electric vehicle tomorrow, you then get a chance to re-register your car online without standing at a queue, and you do so for free. Would that not be tantamount to a consumer incentive without the fiscal drag or even the public expenditure? Of course, there's foregone money lost to the Department of Transport. But I think we have to, going forward, be creative as this transition happens on the production side to what ultimately happens on the demand side. And I think our policy has been that ours will be production and investment-led. And then in the secondary stage, as we indicated in the white paper on electric vehicles, we will then begin, as the fiscal space allows, to contend with whether and what modalities we must use to incentivize consumers.
Ayabonga Tkawe, thank you very much indeed, sir. The Chief Commissioner of the International Trade Administration Commission, Icasa. It's a fascinating conversation. As always, trade conversations go in many, many directions.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Confirmation today from Stats SA, our mining production down by 7.7% year on year in April. The main driver, platinum group metals. Their production was down 24%. Gold production down at 2.5%. Mahlali Setefane is the co-founder, managing director of Setef & Co. Mahlali, good evening. This really shows the impact of low platinum prices on platinum production. Platinum miners have just throttled back production until the platinum prices now surged.
Yeah, evening, Stephen. Totally agreed. I think the significant drop in PGM, has incredibly impacted the country and the country's statistics from a mining perspective. And it's not just from a production perspective, but it's also from a mineral sales perspective when we're looking at the statistics.
I was surprised in a way that gold production was down. I mean, gold price is at record highs now, was still high then. I would have thought mines then were doing everything they could to increase production.
Of course they are, but remember they're operating, in a global market. And I think, again, even with gold, we see a drop in the mining production, but it actually was one of the positive contributors elsewhere in the mineral sales. So by 57.6%. So it just depends which side of the statistics you are looking at. And, gold remains a safe haven overall.
You're looking at the difference between the number of ounces produced and the amount of money that those ounces brought in, and those are two different things.
100%.
So there's a lot that's been going on. I mean, pretty much since the beginning of the industrial age, mining was what drove our economy. It's really what sort of industrialized South Africa and gave us cities where they are in most cases. That really is changing now. I mean, mining seems to almost be shrinking quite quickly in some ways. Its contribution to our economy seems to be getting smaller. There'll be endless arguments that government's responsible for this. I don't want to get into that now. The point is, on the numbers, it does look like mining is shrinking.
Yes, so South Africa's latest mining figures from Stats SA don't paint a positive picture at all, Stephen, because production actually fell by 7.7% year on end in April 2025, and with platinum group metals plunging by 24.1%, and it's actually leading to a downturn. And so the mining industry actually didn't contribute positively to our GDP in Q1 at all. And so there is a downturn in the industry, and it is cause for concern, but I'm always hopeful.
Well, I mean, platinum prices suddenly surging. And I suppose it's an impossible question. At what point do some mines restart production? The moment they do, the platinum price goes down again. So there's a little bit of a careful dance that'll go on.
Yes, there has to be a dance, and I think companies are actually balancing quite a lot. You are balancing your international commodity prices, you are balancing demand, you are balancing operational conditions within the country, and so all of those factors need to make sense for a particular mining company to actually make profits.
Mahlali Sitafane, thanks very much indeed. Co-founder, managing director of Satef & Co.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Graham Kerner's at the Kerner Perspective. Graham, good evening to you. A late night announcement or a late evening announcement our time from Naspers and Prosus. They're earning significantly up. I mean, Prosus up by 90%. The kind of march continues for them.
Yeah, good evening, Stephen. Yeah, but I think, myself and pretty much everybody else in the world is more interested in the NAV of Naspers and Prosus. So maybe the earnings per share is a little less relevant to us, but it was good to see the e-commerce businesses or the guidance that the e-commerce businesses have seemed to have turned the corner as must be taken as good news. And I think we're all going to look forward to results. I think it's next Friday, so we can get the granular detail. But I think the key thing for us is if you look at Naspers, for example, I think it's a 36% discount to NAV. That's really what we all obsess about.
It's interesting to look at certain shares and sort of understand what's happening at the moment relative to us and the US and where money is flowing. So Capitec and Naspers are at very high valuations, relatively speaking, compared to where they normally are. They've been doing very well in the last few months. And then in the US, it seems capital slowly leaving the US. How do you understand what's sort of going on at the moment when you put it all together?
Yeah, it's really like trying to read the tea leaves at the moment, Stephen. I think what you're talking about is the fact that a lot of, if you take South African shares, actually fairly reasonably off their 52-week highs. But those two that you mentioned, the Capitex and the Naspers, for example, almost at 52-week highs. They're both obviously index heavyweights. So I think your point is well made that the market in a way is being skewed, the index performance is being skewed because of the really strong performance by a handful of shares. Whereas if you look a little bit broader, there are actually quite a lot of companies, and you can throw quite a few of them into that mix, even some of the bigger caps that are down 15-20% from their 52-week high. So I think the South African market performance maybe being a little bit skewed, as it so often is, by a few heavyweights. And then I think what you're saying in America is also very powerful. That there was really only one game in town for the last few years, and that was to be overweight US and particularly overweight tech, particularly the so-called Magnificent Seven. And now I think a lot of people, when I chat to guys in the market, a lot of people are sort of battling to find value, particularly in the US. So I think that's what you're talking to, is the fact that, the US has been the star performer. It's been sort of the only market to be in, but people are starting to question that, and the valuation's probably also looking a little bit full. Especially if you're going to have GDP clocking at 1%, for example. So I think that's what the market is wrestling with. It's almost a case of, the guys that have really driven the performance over the last 2, 3, 4 years, maybe not the ones to drive it. And you can see it, for example, in what the dollar has done relative to the euro and the pound, for example.
Well, it's interesting to watch the dollar. There was a Reuters report late this afternoon suggesting that, in fact, the dollar will continue to decline. And it does seem just sort of every day you get that kind of drip effect. I mean, this is how it's the kind of sound of capital moving. It's not all going to Europe, it's going to other places, and I suppose particularly in some ways maybe to gold.
Well, it's going to gold, it's going probably to emerging markets, platinum, because I think just, adding on to your earlier interview, I mean, we're talking about a $200 move off of, let's call it $1,000 an ounce. In platinum, market really was caught flat-footed, and I think that's a combination of supply, as your previous guest was talking about, but also, the demand dynamic. And I would argue that I think one of the reasons that platinum has popped is people are suddenly realizing, to your question, you don't suddenly flick a switch and bring those shafts that were shut or mothballed back online. So I think the market's kind of trying to get its arms around, where's platinum likely to settle if supply and demand is is disrupted as much as we've seen in the last few weeks.
It's been interesting how quickly platinum prices have suddenly surged. And yes, there were a couple of reports beforehand that, platinum, the amount of global platinum available was slightly lower than people had thought. But it is just amazing. And I mean, the people at Valterra must be rubbing their hands in glee. Their timing's been amazing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, for Valterra, we hope that being liberated from the Anglo stable also will allow them to sort of spread their wings and be more focused and hopefully get, over time, a shareholder base that really buys into the story. So, yes, I think to your point, Valterra was really birthed at a very exciting time. So, I take your point, and obviously they've got other factors in their favor as well, in terms of maybe some of the lower costs of production, maybe having a more of a mechanical bias than labor. So, I think Valterra was birthed at exactly the right time.
Thanks very much indeed, Graham Kerner at the Kerner Perspective. Just gone 6:30.
Travel is more than just ticking off countries. It's about the people, the culture, the food, the moments. I'm Pippa Hudson, and on Wonder the World, I invite you to join me every week as we explore destinations both near and far, with the help of fellow adventurers who share their unique travel stories. Listen to my podcast wherever you get them.
702. Stephen is on the Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
011 883 702 021 446 0567. Good to hear from you. We'll be talking about BEE in a couple of moments. But first, the Communications Minister, the DA Solly Malatsi, now saying any decision about granting a Starlink a license to operate would be up to the regulator Icasa. But last month, Malatsi proposed changing BEE regulations in the communications industry that would allow Starlink to use other means to comply with what are currently BEE ownership requirements. Duncan McLeod is the founder and editor at Tech Central. Duncan, good evening. I mean, in a way, Malatsi is really just stating the law. Icasa makes the final decision. It's always been like that. I suppose what he can do is change the criteria on which Icasa makes that decision. Is that the right way to sort of understand what's happening here?
No, I don't think so. I think that, Icasa is an independent regulator. It's independent of the executive arm of government, and that independence is enshrined in the Constitution. So no minister can come along and actually tell Icasa what to do. What the minister is empowered to do under the law is to issue what's called a policy directive, or policy direction. This is something that Icasa is required to consider, but is also entitled to apply its mind to whatever that policy direction says and come to the conclusion that it doesn't make sense and reject it. It's not often that happens, and usually when a policy direction is issued, it's after extensive consultations between the minister, the department, and the regulator. So I'm sure in this case there have been those discussions between the minister or people in the ministry and the regulator about the need to change the license. So I'm sure that this is what the regulator is seriously going to look at now. But technically, under the law, it doesn't have to listen to the minister at all. Okay, now that does make sense when you explain it like that. So we've had the proposals out for public comment. What is the timeline from here? Obviously, and we don't know what Starlink feels about these proposals, never mind whether they'll actually get through, because I wouldn't be surprised if the EFF or even MK or someone tries to delay the whole thing, takes it to court. Elon Musk is a wonderful hate figure. We do know what Starlink thinks about the proposals that Malatsi has put forward here, and they very much support them. In fact, they sent out communication to some of the people in South Africa who expressed an interest in signing up for Starlink services and said, we support what the minister's doing here, and if these rules are changed and the equity requirement goes away, we are very happy to comply with the proposals that are on the table, including the equity equivalent, so-called equity equivalents, which would mean directing money into skills development and community upliftment and all that sort of thing. So they've said it. They are happy with the rules if they change on the equity front.
Do we know what the timeline will be from here? This could all still take some time.
Yeah. These processes do take a long time, and the minister has actually issued the policy direction as a draft, which I don't remember any communication minister doing in the past. They've always simply issued policy directions, and I suspect that's related to managing relations within the government of national unity. Anything to do with BEE is going to get the ANC's backup. So I think that the fact that he issued this as a draft, and there's now going to be debate within Parliament and the GNU about this draft policy direction, which I don't believe is actually necessary. It is going to take some time. There's going to be debate in Parliament. Then the final version of the policy will be sent through to Icasa, and then Icasa will have a period of time to consider it and do market investigations or whatever else it needs to do. So I would be surprised if this whole process is wrapped up this calendar year.
Sure. I must say, for me, with a sort of slightly political hat on, the great risk is that Julius Malema or someone decides to take the whole thing to court, and there's so many steps at which you could do that actually it could even take longer than that. And I mean, that would obviously irritate Elon even further, and that would be a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure I can comment properly on that. But certainly, if there was some sort of legal action, I don't see why. I don't think any legal action would succeed here, because the minister is very much following the letter of the law. But I suppose if someone decides to take the whole process on review, it could lead to delays.
Duncan McLeod, thank you so much, founder and editor at techcentral.co.za. 12 minutes to 7.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025.
Well, yet another intervention in the debate around the black economic empowerment today. A debate which has sort of resurfaced in the last few weeks. Today, the Solidarity Research Group and the Free Market Foundation together putting out a report. They claim broad-based black economic empowerment is costing us around 2 percentage points of GDP. As you know, this is fiercely contested. There have been plenty of voices being critical of BE in recent weeks, but last night on The Money Show, I asked the chair of Vodacom, Saki Matlazoma, if he would defend BEE.
You cannot have a political settlement without an economic consequence. And we were forced to compromise on radical economic transformation, to use that terminology, at the time of negotiations. And what we needed most then was stability, to stabilize the country and then deal with certain issues in the fullness of time, if you like. And therefore, one of the things we did in the negotiations on the Constitution was to make sure that the Constitution allows black economic empowerment. It wasn't even called that then, but allows redress. Precisely because we understood that there's no such a thing that we can have a group of people of a certain hue holding political power and another group of people with a different hue holding economic power. That's a recipe for disaster. And a lot of poor people in the process, and so until we have reached a certain particular equilibrium in between those two forces in society, we will always have tumultuous times. Would I defend it? Yes, absolutely. I believe that empowering people who have been previously disadvantaged is the right kind of thing. It may be that the terminology of black economic empowerment is the one that creates the emotion, if you like, especially if you think about foreigners. The fact of the matter is that we need to have the redress, and we have not done it to the extent that we should have. And I am also aware of the fact that I would not have done the kinds of things that I've done in my life if I had not had the opportunity granted to me by the policy of redress.
The chair of Vodacom, Saki Matlazoma, on The Money Show this evening. Last night, rather. Dr. Kwezi Mabasa is a sociology lecturer at the University of Pretoria, but is also the economic and social policy lead at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, South Africa. Kwezi, good evening. I do appreciate the time. There are so many arguments about this. One of the claims that is often made is that BE is holding our economy back. If you remove BEE and broad-based economic empowerment, the economy would automatically grow. Is that true?
No, because evening, Stephen, and even to the listeners. That's not true, because our growth problem is related to structural factors, such as our challenges related to infrastructure, the fact that we have high inequality, which decreases demand in the economy. We also have problems related to uneven spatial development. So, and also lack of investment in critical sectors. So South Africa has a multi-layered growth problem. So this idea of reducing our growth problems to just be is wrong. The second thing why it's wrong, let's look back at a couple of years. When we had some of the highest BEE transactions, especially between the period of the 2000 to 2008, South Africa actually experienced one of its longest period of sustained economic growth. So this sort of relationship that is drawn between the implementation of BEE and an impediment to growth is not true at all because of those two factors. Yeah.
Is there an economic impact in terms of holding the economy back at all? I mean, could it be just a very small factor, or do you think that's not true too?
I think it's not true because remember, I mean, if you look at some of the studies that have been conducted by the IMF and World Bank, they have clearly stated that whenever you have inequality, inequality actually holds back growth. And in our case, remember, our inequality isn't just class-based. It's also race and gendered. I mean, if we look at the latest Stats SA household expenditure survey, it was very clear in reaching this conclusion. So we have to deal with this racialized inequality for us to achieve growth. And for me, the argument is not do you either grow the economy first or you pursue redress. You need a model that does both. So that we can have an inclusive sort of growth path. The World Bank has advised us to do the same thing, and even the IMF. So I think we need to focus on that. And redress policies are important for achieving that. What we can debate is whether the model of redress is producing the intended socio-economic redistributive impact. That's what we've got to get to.
There's another point, and it goes to what Sakima Xolzoma was saying. I mean, there would be social consequences if we stopped it, right?
Yes, because and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that. So when there's a direct link between inequality and instability in the country. So in other words, we need to decrease inequality of more of a stable country and society, but also, again, inequality creates social division. There's been clear research that shows the links between inequality and criminality. And so you need to deal away with inequality. And because of the history of our country, unfortunately, the reality is that our inequality is racialized. And that's why we need this broader conception of Black economic empowerment, which, by the way, is not only about promoting enterprise development for previously disadvantaged groups. It includes things like employment equity as well, which have a wider impact that go beyond just individual entrepreneurs. Yes.
There's so many aspects to this. Our economy is not growing, and arguably BEE is not working in the way that you, and I think most people would want it to work, in that it's not actually creating more black wealth, which is really, in some ways, the fundamental challenge of South Africa.
Yeah. What we want is a BEE model that creates Black economic empowerment broadly. And what do we mean by that? So it's a model that's about redress, but that also produces jobs, right? It's a model about redress that also skills individuals. It's a model about redress that also promotes different forms of ownership, which is not only based on just individual entrepreneurs, but also includes cooperatives, community enterprises, trade union, even led factories and the likes. You also want a BEE model that also ensures that it addresses uneven spatial development in the country. So in other words, there must be investment and Black economic empowerment strategies that address economic diversification and growth and productivity, even in rural areas and townships. That's what we need. And to achieve that, you don't throw away redress. What you do is that you maintain redress, but then you link it to other economic policies and support measures so that you can produce all these things that I'm talking about. Yeah.
I don't know. So I mean, one of the frustrating things of my job, which is to manage these conversations, is that people talk about it constantly, and so we should. It is an attempt at what I would call constructive, progressive, maybe a better word, but I'd use both those words as social engineering, right? You have to be deliberate about it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And that's why it's so controversial, okay? You would expect it to be controversial, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that at all. What I don't see is any kind of change coming from anyone. Lots of ideas, lots of thoughts, both about growing the economy and BEE. But I just don't see anything changing, and I worry with the sort of what I see as a fracturing of our politics, that actually we're not going to see any change at all. This will just stay the law for some time.
I think there's been changes, but the changes have not been substantial. So we know we have the growth of the middle class, for example. We know that we've had some individuals or groups who've entered into different forms of ownership and BE transactions. We also know that we have even had the support, although it's not enough, of these different forms of ownership that I'm talking about, cooperatives in specific sectors like agriculture, retail. And so we do see the change, but it's not substantive. And my argument is because the problem with BE isn't just about the act or the codes, is that we haven't linked BE enough with these other economic support measures that can allow it to produce the intended outcomes. And I want to argue that it's not about just a racial demographic issue. Is that you need to link racial demographics to things like jobs, as I'm saying, skills, building local value chains, because that adds more value to the economy. And we also have to learn from international experiences. I mean, Malaysia has had their own redress policy. And actually, ironically, even some states in the US have also had preferential procurement and affirmative action. The East Asian developmental states also had a targeted sort of redress policy. But the point is that it's not something that we must think we'll never achieve, because there are also these other international case studies that can actually show us how to do it in a way that produces broader developmental outcomes. Yeah.
Dr. Kwesi Mabasa, thanks very much indeed. Sociology lecturer at the University of Pretoria, economic and social policy lead at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, South Africa. Coming up in the next little while, quite a strange case involving Meta, yes, Facebook, about a company that was using AI nudity platforms on Meta. All sorts of issues there. We'll talk about entrepreneurial education and then alternative investments. All of that to come. Good evening at 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa CIB, powering Africa's potential from ground to grid. Proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025. Good evening. Welcome to the second hour of the program. We'll talk about some of the stuff that goes on Facebook in just a moment. Also, education around entrepreneurship, all sorts of conversations around that. But looking forward to investment school this evening, Dr. Musamal Wandla from Differential Capital will be talking about investing in what are called alternative assets. In other words, not going into stocks and bonds, but actually going into something else. I mean, gold's probably a pretty good investment at the moment, but we'd actually be looking at things like old cars or, cigars. Wine maybe is a good example. Things like that. Of course, there are some questions. You have to store them. You don't always get much yield, but still, there's something very interesting about this. And when you consider what's happening on bond markets and stock markets at the moment, may actually just be easier and safer to invest in those because you know that there won't be quite so much volatility. Good to hear from you, of course, on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
So I'm sure you saw the Supreme Court of Appeal ruling on the New Lane case. This is essentially the first state capture case. An acting judge, Nompumelelo Gusha, in the Free State threw the case out, said the prosecution had basically not made their case. The NPA came in for a lot of flack as a result. The Supreme Court of Appeal, I don't think I've ever read a judgment that's been so scathing of a judge, basically saying she closed her ears to the state's case and essentially ruling that the case must be heard again in front of a different judge. As I say, I mean, astonishing. I have several questions about all of it. I am very glad, for various reasons, that the NPA was found to be right, that the appeal was granted, that it was heard, that the SCA came to the ruling it did, because it matters for the NPA. Without the NPA, without a prosecuting authority that's effective, that's competent, well, there's no rule of law and we are lost as a nation. So I'm glad on that. I do not understand how an acting judge could be assigned to this case. We all knew how important it was. The NPA had made the point many times that the New Lane case was the kind of textbook for state capture. Because it worked there, then the Guptas, and we've heard from the Zondo Commission and all of the findings, basically carried out the same model in other places. And what the NPA hoped to do is get a conviction here that'll lead to the convictions in other cases. Without this acting judge's finding, by the way, we might well have had the Guptas here and not in Dubai. So my two questions really go to the acting judge, Nompumelelo Gusha, who is not really in a position to say anything in public at this stage. But perhaps someone should find a way for her to answer questions on this. But I also have a question for Judge Kagni Musi. He is the Chief Justice, he's the Judge President rather, in the Free State. Sir, if I may ask, and I realize as a judge you're under no obligation to answer, but if I may ask, why did you assign an acting judge to this particular case? Look at what happened as a result. And maybe you could not have foreseen that. But surely, from the very beginning, you found your most senior judge, which, sir, might well have been you. Would that not have been better?
7:02.
7:02.
Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, I don't know if you've ever come across this on the internet, but occasionally there are cases involving nudity. Sometimes, and you'll know how big these cases can be, they involve what's called revenge porn and things like that. Now, the owners of Facebook, Meta, they are suing a company called Crush AI for using their app to advertise a nudity platform. As I understand it, what they do is they will take a picture of me fully clothed and say, this is what Stephen looks like when he's not fully clothed, basically, is what they mean. Siphumelele Zondi is our tech expert. Siphumelele, good evening. Okay, this is a fascinating case. What happened?
Hello, Stephen. So what basically happened is that this Crush AI, as it's known, or Joy Timeline HK, as is its registered name out in Hong Kong, has been advertising all over Facebook and using basically different names and different company names when they are sending out these adverts. So Facebook would take down an ad and they'd upload another one with a different name. They'd take that down and then take down the URL as well in the account, and then they'd go back and upload another ad under a different name, basically directing people to their platform, their Crush AI platform, which allows people to undress other people using artificial intelligence. And so Facebook or Meta has decided that they're now going to go to court in Hong Kong and file a lawsuit against this company because it seems like a losing battle because they take it down and it appears as something else. But they're all redirecting users of Facebook to their platform.
Okay, I mean, no one wants this to happen to them, right? But there is a very strange philosophical argument to have because it wouldn't really be my body that was having a picture taken of it. It's AI's interpretation of my body. So, I mean, the argument could be philosophically, this is actually something else. It's not Stephen.
Oh, totally. But in the US for the last couple of months to a year, they actually have had a proliferation of these platforms, not just this particular one, but other platforms that do the same thing. And the worry there are repercussions, especially for children in schools, because there have been children out in the US who have said it's happened to them, and then an image of a child circulating in their school, and it wouldn't be them, it wouldn't be their body. But what does that do then to the mental health of the child? Also, when you think about the type of work that perhaps Stephen does, right? And Stephen is not allowed to be naked out in public because of the work that he does. And so now he is in trouble at work because he is parading naked on the internet.
Sure. There's social media rules. I mean, you can't just post nudity even on something as wild as X.
Totally. Well, X seems to have sort of eased up on it. They didn't in the past. They do now after Elon Musk bought it. And they said they're going to ease up on it. But on other platforms like Meta platforms, Facebook, Instagram, in fact, they're very clear on their policy out at Meta that you need to be clear that it's for education purposes. They will allow it then, or for medical purposes, they would allow it then, but if it's not, then it's going to be taken down.
I mean, there's so many things that happen in these moments, and I suppose that the rule of law matters too, but the rule of law that social media has and what actually the rule of law says, they'll be completely different. In other words, X might have completely different interpretations than what the law actually says.
But think about South Africa's Cybercrimes Act, right, which looks at very many things, including a posting of nudity, especially if it's not your own body. That it says you need to have consent from the individual, even if the individual did send you their photograph or a photograph of themselves in the nude, but they need to give consent so that you can then pass it on or post it up online. And so I think it's such things that can perhaps be looked into or looked at in this case. And yes, you can argue that it's not the actual body of the individual, but does it not have the same repercussions? Would other people not think the same as they would if they saw the person's actual body? Because what's to prove if it's AI that it actually isn't? So maybe it's such laws that can be looked at and used in this particular case, like the Cybercrimes Act in South Africa.
I mean, we know that the laws against revenge porn, there's actually been an important judgment in our law around that. The problem is it's always finding the person who did it. And I presume when, in this case, you wouldn't need to know the person that you've created this image of. You wouldn't need to know Stephen. And that's what makes it so difficult. But there would have to be repercussions, I mean, if people are doing this and then posting images on social media.
That's why Meta is going after the company that's doing it. That's why law enforcement in America has been going over companies that allow people to do this, because it becomes difficult to go after individuals, because it could be just about anybody sitting in their bedroom, right? And then they upload it. And also because the way the internet works and the way that AI works nowadays is that it's in the hands of just about every single individual on earth. So they're now going after the companies that seem to be doing this or enabling people to break the law.
Thank you very much indeed. Siphumelele Zondi, our tech expert. It's kind of one of the scarier conversations we've had about the world of tech in a little while. I mean, you don't even have to know the person. They can just make stuff up. I mean, it's very frightening. If something like this has happened to you, 011 883 0702 021 446 0567.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, confirmation this week. Schools are going to be taking on the teaching of entrepreneurship in a much bigger way. It'll happen across the country. And the Minister, Saviwe Gachube, outlining the new program being funded in part, I understand, by the European Union. Dave Tate is the Senior Director of Entrepreneurial Education Programs at the African Leadership Academy. Dave, good evening. I really appreciate the time. How do you teach entrepreneurship?
Hi, Stephen. Nice to be on the show. I'll try and keep it short. So we've got a couple of programs at African Leadership Academy. One of them is a 2-year program within a high school. So that's 300 hours of face time with students. And then the other program that I want to talk about is Anzisha, and that primarily deals with enabling very young entrepreneurs through another 2-year program that builds out the skills and tools that they need to build their businesses.
Okay, but what are you actually teaching them to do? I mean, if you teach someone geography, you teach them the capital of South Africa is, obviously Johannesburg and not Cape Town. That's a joke. What do you teach them in entrepreneurship?
So I think there's a lot of mindset work that we do with people. But when we're talking about the 2-year Anzisha program, we actually do a series of modules, and they start off with planning. We do business strategy and modeling. We move on to marketing and sales. There's some operations work, partnerships, and obviously investment. So those are the big topics that we take them through.
Okay,
and
so
I just want to add...
Yeah, so it's the nuts and bolts of running a company, starting it up, getting it going, all of that stuff.
Yeah. It's essentially growing the business and then supporting the entrepreneur as well. So we're betting on the jockey or the entrepreneur that they can build a sustainable business and create jobs for other young people.
We've spoken to a lot of people who started businesses on this program, and some of them seem to have been born, they started very young. They were hustling from, 10. They were literally, in some cases, the guy with the lemonade stand. They were the person buying the sweets from the shop and then walking around and knocking on doors and had a regular round, things like that. There was a fitness guy who, under the most incredibly difficult conditions, was creating a business. Can you make an entrepreneur?
It's a great question. So I think entrepreneurship can be taught. I think naturally they are born entrepreneurs because they have certain characteristics. They're risk takers. They actually see problems as opportunities, and they're in love with the problem, not the solution. I would like more and more people to become entrepreneurs, and I think it's this shift that we're doing in South Africa at the moment. It's actually going to open up the opportunities that entrepreneurship, even if it's just on a mindset level, can have.
There have been some schools and some attempts to teach younger people entrepreneurship already. Is it possible to assess if those are working? I mean, is the teaching of entrepreneurship leading to more entrepreneurs?
So, I mean, take us away from South Africa just for a little bit. I mean, talk a little bit about Rwanda. So, Rwanda, a long time ago, introduced entrepreneurship as a subject, as a mandatory subject in high school for all students, because they knew that long term, even if a certain percentage of school graduates only took up entrepreneurship, they would still be creating this kind of like culture of entrepreneurship. So that's probably the best example I can think of. I think in South Africa, there are a lot of different initiatives that are happening. Some of them are running in schools. I think probably some of the most successful ones are running parallel to schools. So if you think about junior achievement, they've got a very successful program that is not in the curriculum. It kind of runs parallel to that. So there are some successful models.
I did junior achievement a very long time ago, and I do remember it very clearly. It really did teach you the nuts and bolts of things. I worry a little bit about government doing this, and let me just explain what I mean. The problem as we sort of see it is that the economy is not growing and there are no jobs. That's the problem. So the solution then is, okay, we will teach children, we'll teach younger people to be entrepreneurs. Okay, I have no objection to that. But actually, we don't have a society that enables small businesses and entrepreneurship. So I'm talking about things like the rule of law, violence, electricity, water problems, all of that. And what that then allows is government will say, look, we fixed it. We're teaching it. It'll be fine. Just wait a few years. When actually no one is really concentrating on the much bigger things. And we've had, particularly actually in this feature, we've spoken to so many people who've made the point, you know, we have a business registration culture rather than actually helping a small business culture. I mean, it was a phrase that really stood out for me, that. And I think that must be true, and I worry that it'll make us, I mean, I completely support what you're doing. I just worry it allows government to sort of wash its hands of the problem.
Yeah. I think that there's several challenges that very young entrepreneurs face. There's definitely the access to funding. There's a difficulty of registering businesses, et cetera, et cetera. I think I'm a little bit skeptical as well around like government taking control of this. It feels like almost like a top-down approach where we may not be meeting the needs of pupils in schools or children. So, I would say I'm a little bit also skeptical. I think solutions around that is that we have to embrace this culture of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship doesn't have a great reputation. If you think about township economies, entrepreneurship is often seen as like hustlers or very micro ventures that are often operating on the side of the road. I think we've got to change that culture as well, so that parents of children, teachers of children, actually encourage young people to take up entrepreneurship. There are obviously different stakeholders along the value chain. Like once we start thinking about like how do people get access to funding, that's very difficult. And what has happened since the announcement earlier this week is that it looks like there's some big policy changes happening, which is very difficult to do. It sounds good theoretically, but like, does that actually come down to the ground and make a difference? So it's this kind of tension between, are you building a culture of embracing entrepreneurship, or are you putting policies in place that may or may not work? So I'm more for the coming from the bottom and changing mindsets.
I mean, I recall a conversation I had with a government official who I think must have been of my generation. And she seemed to suggest that actually young people were almost at fault because they were not entrepreneurial. and she was quite sort of annoyed when I said, I think it's because my generation has failed the younger generation, bluntly. And so I just worry that, so as I say, I support everything that you're doing. We can't make it the younger generation's problem. We've got to make it as enabling as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're very focused on what does a very young entrepreneur need? If you think about it, they're actually our customers. So when we design programs, we're not designing something that doesn't apply to their context. It has to be very specific. Like, this is actually for a young entrepreneur. And I think you're right. It is our responsibility, especially in South Africa. Like, older generations, we have to enable this next generation. Otherwise, I think if we, and I think this is why this is such a good initiative. It's the fact that it's actually started. I think it started too late, obviously, but it's starting, which is, I'm really excited.
Dave Tate, thanks very much indeed, the Senior Director for Entrepreneurial Education Programs at the African Leadership Academy.
The Money Show.
Investment School.
Well, as you know, we've often looked at markets, we've looked at stocks, we've looked at bonds, we've looked particularly over the last few months at the volatility in all of that market. Tonight on Investment School, we're looking at what you would call alternative investments. So things that are not sort of normal, but may act as a really good store of value and increase in value over time. So, for example, cryptocurrencies is perhaps the ultimate one at the moment, but we would include art, wine, I suppose maybe cigars, who knows, cars, things like that. That's what we're looking at this evening. In the studio with me, Dr. Musa Malwandla is the Co-Chief Investment Officer at Differential Capital. Musa, good evening. Thanks so much for coming in.
Good evening, and good evening to the listeners.
I suppose the first question would be, why would we want an alternative investment? What's wrong with everything else? And I mean, the answer to that is plenty.
Yeah, so I think the best way to think about it is in terms of how you normally put together a portfolio, right? So you think about what is called the traditional three factors. So one is investment return. So in other words, what is the expected return on the asset? So if you buy it today, what do you expect on the other end when you eventually sell it? The other part is risk. In other words, how risky is it? So if things go wrong, how much do you stand to lose? And then the last piece is how well it fits in with everything else you have in the portfolio. Now, for the alternative investments, the last piece is actually generally the most important, is that it diversifies what you're already holding. So something like crypto, the presumption is usually that when things are going bad, it's doing it at least a bit better. So it's usually like, a substitute for gold. In fact, some people have said it's digital gold. If gold had mood swings.
Yeah. I'm not convinced of that, by the way, but yes, I've heard the argument.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So that's the one part. And you can say the same about, things like fine art, collectible cars and so on. Now, the problem is the middle part as well, because the risk component, in that while you might expect that, so the saying is often that, companies can go bankrupt, but a Picasso can't go bankrupt, right? So there's a protection in holding something like fine art. Now, on the other end is that you've seen, so if you track, there are various indices that track things like fine art, collectible cars. In the great financial recession, so the GFC of 2008, that index, so some of these indices collapsed as much as your traditional S&P and so on. So I think that argument is not as strong, but at least from a diversification perspective, that argument is quite strong. So I think those are maybe the more general things you might look at. Now, there are a few specific things that you then need to look at when you think about these alternative assets. So the first one is liquidity, is that if you buy stocks, it's very easy for you to liquidate, to just simply sell it when you need to buy something else. With fine art, not so much. With cars, maybe with crypto. In fact, with crypto, you might argue that's covered. The other part is transaction costs, right? So if you think about the transaction cost for buying a share, it's usually a fraction of a percent. It's not that much. Whereas if you're buying fine art, a car, you're buying it on auction, you have to pay the auction value, the auction, commissions and so on. There's also then the carry cost. In other words, how much does it cost you to hold on to the asset?
Well, I was going to ask, because, I mean, if you've got a very fancy old car, so you've got a Ferrari California or something, I think only 50 were made, you have to store that somewhere. It has to be safe. Someone has to drive it very carefully, all of those things.
Precisely. So what happens there is, even with art, right, you have to, maintain it. I mean, there are various, things that you have to do to it. You have to hold insurance against it. So there are several issues with that, Kerry. So that's the other component. Now, on the offsetting piece, which is usually not how you look at normal financial assets, is what you call the social aspect of it, or what economists call possessional goods. So what that is there are certain things that we hold, not just for what they give us financially, or even the utility of the thing, but rather what it proves to the other people around you. So having people for dinner and, talking about your fancy new painting and so on. So I think that part is probably as strong with fine arts and so on. And interesting enough, just one more point is with something like crypto. In fact, even with something like shares in Tesla, and there is an affiliation that you get from holding that. There's a social sort of value that you derive from it. So there are those kinds of aspects, and I think they fit squarely even within something like crypto.
I mean, that would make sense. You're sort of giving a nod to you go in this direction, as it were.
Yeah.
So, okay, are there moments when you should look more at alternative investments than other moments? In other words, when we're in a moment of great volatility like we are now, do alternative investments look a little bit more attractive than they would otherwise? Especially when we're in the middle of a great kind of capital switch. Money's been going into the US now, some of it's leaving the US. You're looking for a safe haven. Would Picasso be a good place?
Yeah, so yes and no. So here's the problem with that is, the answer for something like crypto would likely be yes, in the sense that it is as we said, it's a type of gold. It's a safe haven asset. It doesn't collapse as much when things are going bad. Now the problem is that with a lot of the other assets, the argument has often been that they are less volatile, but it's not the volatility. It's not the difference with something like equities is that we watch equity prices on a daily basis, so we don't see the volatility, right? It's not, we don't see the mark to market. Whereas with something like a Picasso, a car that's sitting in your garage, you don't see the valuation, but it's actually there. It's collapsing, it's bobbing up and down. And what's even more important with something like that, with something that experiences that level of volatility, is that the point at which you buy becomes a lot more important, right? Is that you can buy at the wrong point in the cycle, when something is up. And, so for instance, there would have been a point where you bought Bitcoin and lost half of it, right? Well, now you would be up, but that's a separate argument. So I think the direct answer is that there is a point in time to buy, but it isn't as compelling for a lot of the other assets, so the non-crypto assets, as it is for something like crypto, that's a safe haven.
One of the arguments against this would be that if I buy a share in Capitec or ShockBright, or even if I bought a Platinum share a year ago, it would probably have paid me out a dividend at some point. And crypto, Picasso, who's a completely different character, but does exist, all of that won't, Car might love it, but it won't pay me a dividend. And isn't that an argument against it? And it's the same for bonds, of course, because you also get a payment there.
Yeah, so look, you're absolutely right in a sense in that whenever you buy an asset, you need to think carefully about what sits on the other side. In other words, what use do you want to put the asset to? So you think about your cash flow demands over the next few years.
Yeah.
And that's even more important in the case of something like, buying a collectible car, because you can't liquidate it, right? It's much harder to liquidate at the right time. So that's definitely it. So if you are going to buy or invest in an asset like that, it's much more important to think about your cash flow requirements over the next few years. And also how much of a cash buffer do you have? How much liquidity do you have in other assets that you would be able to liquidate if you need the capital.
The other thing is that when you are getting constant valuations of a company's shares, so again, Capitec, you can see them going up and up and up and sometimes down if something happens, whatever it is. You kind of know where you are, and you made the point that you don't actually know the valuation, right? So for example, there was a South African artist, and I forget her name now, but suddenly, Marlene Dumas, that's right. Her artwork sold for 245 million rand at an auction, makes her, I think, the world's sort of strange kind of figure, but the most expensive female living artist. Okay, it's a very strange title. Someone will make a band name of it. But you wouldn't have predicted that 20 years ago, and you wouldn't know in 20 years if her artwork will still be worth that. What I'm trying to say is tastes change, and today's cryptocurrency could be tomorrow's tulip, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. 100% right. So you actually saw a lot of that with non-fungible tokens, right? That came into vogue in 20. I mean, it's still there in the market, right? You can still buy these things. But the problem, that's essentially the problem, right? Is there are certain types of assets that, so with a company, you know what, it'll always have value. The value is the profits that
and you can see company, if it works.
You can see if it works.
Yeah.
So now with something like, a collectible, that argument is much harder to make. Now, on the other hand, is with something like crypto, right? So cryptocurrency is that the presumption from a fundamental perspective is that as more people buy into enter the network and so on, it gains more value, right?
Yeah.
And with in periods of higher inflation and so on, that accelerates. So there is, in some sense, a fundamental anchor. In other words, something that's deriving value for cryptocurrency. It's much harder to say that for other assets, though. And I think that's where the possessional good aspect becomes more important. In that you usually buy these things because you see you yourself see value in it. Yeah.
So I mean, for example, you could say, okay, I've got a petrol-driven car. An old petrol-driven car. In 50 years' time, people are going to look at that and think, well, you can't drive it anymore, you can't get petrol, everything's electric. But it could suddenly become so much more valuable because it's the last sort of fossil of its kind, and you don't know how that's going to go.
Yeah, well, that's true, and it could swing the complete other way in the sense that maybe in 50 years' time, with the effects of climate change, we'll now really hate these kinds of things.
Yeah. But
again,
it'll be the modern day Tesla.
Precisely, and what happens is that if you think about that risk component that we spoke about earlier, where we usually argue that Picasso can't go bankrupt, it could happen, right? It could happen that these things completely lose value.
We're speaking to Dr. Musamal Wandla, the Co-Chief Investment Officer at Differential Capital, looking at alternative investments tonight on Investment School. You with The Money Show.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025.
The Money Show.
Investment School.
Dr. Musamal Wandla in our studio, the Co-Chief Investment Officer at Differential Capital. We're looking at alternative investments this evening because of, when you're bored with stocks and bonds and, the person who you might be bored with as a result of all of this. Okay, so Musa, when you're looking at these things, they're all a little specialist. Cryptocurrencies, I'm just going to put to one side for a moment. But if you're looking at art, cars, wine, it's not the kind of thing you just go and say, I'm going to buy that. You would actually need to do a lot of research, but actually you would probably need to speak and pay an expert.
Yeah, that's also true. So that's part of those transaction costs. Now, there are in today's world platforms where you can, in fact, so the other problem with buying things like collectibles is that you would be buying, so the ticket sizes are massive, right? You can't just buy a share for 1,000 rands and so on. You would be buying something for 1 million now. That limits your ability to diversify. Now, coming back to the original point is that there are platforms that help you do this, right? So you can not just firstly, the appraisal of the art would happen on the platform, and also you would be able to buy fractions of the art. So you could buy maybe a fraction of 10 paintings and so on. So that at least covers some of the problems with appraisals. But you're still 100% correct in that there's a lot of opacity in how you. So even the purchase price that you would pay at the beginning, and even when you eventually dispose of the asset, you never really know, whether you're getting fair price and what is a fair price. So I think those kinds of things sort of prohibitive for most investors.
Does it matter how long you want the investment for? So if you're thinking of art, the longer you hold it, if it's a big name, I imagine you could probably buy a share in a Da Vinci painting. If you can buy a share in a Boxers, you should be able to buy a share in a Da Vinci painting. That it might be the kind of thing that you stick with all of the others. It's got to fit in with the rest of your portfolio, but it's the kind of diversity share, if you like, not for you, not for your old age, but actually for your grandchildren. It's that kind of legacy wealth kind of thing.
I suppose so. So again, the problem is the point you made earlier around who knows what trends will look like in 50 years. However, I will say this, that when you look at the indices that track fine arts, collectible cars and so on, it's quite clear that they do actually perform quite well in the long term. They don't give you as much upside as equities. So equities actually beat, there's something called the equity premium puzzle in markets where, for some reason or another, in fact, no one has ever figured it out, equities just outperform more than what is justified by the underlying if you do a sum of the parts or bottom-up theoretical analysis. So they don't really outperform that asset class, but they still perform well enough. And I think for that reason, from a diversification perspective, they do make sense. However, going back to another earlier point around liquidity, if you're buying it in your pension, as part of your retirement plan, and you're retiring in 5 years and you'll need some of the cash flow, it's probably not a very good idea, right? And in fact, even at best, if you're a normal investor, the guidance usually for these alternative types of assets is never more than 5% of your portfolio. So yes, put away some money towards these things, but you want to be cautious around it.
I suppose it also takes you to, do you get involved in different parts of the same kind of product? So you wouldn't buy a whole Picasso, you'd buy, a fraction of one and a fraction of a Marlene Dumas. And you'll do the same with crypto. You'd buy a little bit of Bitcoin and a little bit of something else. You would sort of try and spread the load a little bit, and that could have pluses and minuses. You don't really know what's going to happen.
100%. So what happens is with even within the crypto space, there are different types of cryptocurrencies for different use cases. So, for things like non-fungible tokens, that's a marketplace on its own. Bitcoin has a certain purpose in the market, and I think it's very important. So with any active investment, it's important to think about, firstly, why are you buying that asset, right? What kind of return potential do you expect from it? In the same way as you would think about a company. Now, it's much harder for these alternative assets. So for something like, a cryptocurrency, it's that, you might have a thesis around network effects, around, more adoption or, a hedge against inflation. Now, for a Picasso, it's much less clear around how you would think about that. But I think it's important still to be grounded in some sort of philosophy of how you're picking these assets.
Do you see? So obviously, the value of alternative assets goes up and down, and the demand for them goes up and down. But the market for them is only going to get more and more sophisticated, right? Over time, it's still going to develop more. As we now have an index for fine art, we're going to possibly have indices for other things.
Yeah, so I think that the hope would be that as these, sort of niche markets develop, we'll get better understanding, and even eventually we might be able to model them and figure out how to include them in a pension fund. As of today, cryptocurrency is not included in the pension fund regulation, and I think that's for good reason, right? Is that we don't have a good theoretical way of thinking about the risk reward relationship and diversification.
Dr. Musa Malwandla, thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it. Chief Investment Officer at Differential Capital Alternative Investments on your non-alternative investment school.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the Africa Energy Forum 2025.
Well, I'm going to go home and look at my Picasso. I'm going to look at my Ferrari. But actually, I'm probably just going to go and look at my medicinal cupboard, if you know what I mean. That's it for The Money Show. Back again tomorrow. It's 8 o'clock.